So, great. So, thank you all so much. So, last week we had this tremendously exciting opening discussion by Paul, and then a very, very exciting discussion amongst all of us. So, my thoughts today is let's begin sort of where we left off with that discussion. And I'll throw out some possible ways of thinking through what we were discussing and then move into some of the Chinese material as well. So, to begin with where we left off, just to remind you, we left off with a key paradox, which is particularly in America, this sense that all individuals should be these radically creative, stunning people who are always doing something new. And so this constant focus on innovation, creativity, newness. And we're mentioning that you find this along with all of the other things we were discussing. The fact that you would take personality tests and somehow be slottable into a set of pre-given possibilities that would somehow define your entire existence. And we were discussing how both of these could be true. So let me throw out a thought as to what might be going on. This would be more of an anthropological observation, but I make it because if there's something to this, it would open up a way possibly of seeing the philosophical genesis of these current conceptions, and then hopefully in turn allow us to bring in some of the Chinese material in ways that might be productively um, contrastive. Contrastive in the sense of opening up different possibilities than those we're seeing in this conception we've been discussing. So here's my throw out possibility that what is really going on in this mindset now, very dominant in America, but certainly going global at this point, is the notion that all of us, every single individual at birth, has a pre-given true self, and that our goal is to look within and find it. And the reason I want to put it that way is going back to Jonas's wonderful phrase that all of the notions of innovation are always in terms of, as he termed it, self-expression. And I think that is absolutely right. There is a self that expresses itself in a certain way. All discussions of creativity are all about me, the individual, expressing my true self, really looking within, finding myself. Talks of innovation are always about, yes, I looked within and I felt that this is the poem I had to write. This is the song I had to write. This is the dance I had to dance. It's always about this pre-given self. This is also why I think Americans are not in any manner, shape, or form perturbed by the fact that, yes, they can take a personality test that has an incredibly limited number of possible personality types, and that does not bother them, that they can take that test. They fully believe that this, that personality type they're slotted into is them. They have no problem arguing that they should then define their lives according to that personality type. It should define their major in college, their future career. Dating apps can use that type to find who they should be perfectly matched with in terms of dating. All of that seems perfectly plausible and not in any way paradoxical with the claim of radical creativity, because the sense is there already is some pre-existent self in there. Going back to Anastasia's points about notions of gender, same thing. So the view is there are a limited number of gender types that you can be. Yes, it is plural, but it is limited. And if you claim to be a certain thing, you need a category. So if I were to say, okay, I'm asexual, that has to be a category, and there should then be an identity group around that category of people who have the same shared self. And again, the point here isn't that it's perfectly fine if people choose, not to have sex. It's the notion is intriguing that you have to have a category to define it, and that there are a limited number of such categories. And again, if the concern was really about creativity and innovation, you would think people would say, no, there's no gender type or sexuality type that can define me. There's no any more than there's a single pre-given personality slot that could predefine me because I am, radically changing and always creative and new. But that really is not the concern. It's always find that category that will explain me, and that will help me find an identity group, a career path, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what is really going on here is a claim of a true self. And all of these shifts that Paul was so beautifully articulating, from sincerity to authenticity, I actually would like to say they come out of this shared sense. So both really come out of this sense that there is a true self. And I'd like to emphasize this because if one does a genealogy of this notion, it really does emerge at a certain time. You can see it developing progressively in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and then becoming very, very dominant thereafter. It primarily comes out, of course, of Protestant notions of a self that is already there. It is true because it is given by God. It is what gives you access to truth, because if you look within and find that true self, it will give you direct access to God and therefore to truth. And in the secular version dominant today, of course, you take God out, but the focus then is still, and almost exclusively, therefore, this true self that gives you truth precisely because it is there. If you look within, you can find it. Now, if there's anything to this, I mention it to make the following point, which is the following. In classical China, do you see notions of a true self? Now, the intriguing answer is going to be yes, as we'll see later. I will discuss it a little less today, but I suspect later in the class we will get to this. A notion of a Zhenwu absolutely appears. It is very, very important. I will argue, and I think Paul fully agrees with this as well, this is something fundamentally different from the notion of the true self that has become so dominant. And I would even make the following argument, and I suspect here too, Paul and I are in full agreement, that that notion comes out of the sets of ideas I'm about to discuss. So what I would like to discuss in terms of the classical Chinese materials that are, I think, intriguing to think through, given this predominance of a notion of a true self, is the following. I would like to argue that the predominant view in early China, and this will continue through much of the classical tradition, hot debates as to what this means that I'm about to articulate, but the grounding set of views tends to be along the following lines. Human beings are all equally, and again, this is fascinating. There are very few other philosophical traditions I know that really begin with this as an opening claim. All of us are equally messes of different stuff. The stuff will usually, by the 4th century BCE, be termed as qi. That qi is usually translated as energies, but it's important to note it includes all of the things that would often be put under very different categories in what will become Western thinking. So, for example, emotions are oftentimes thought of in terms of these qi, types of qi that then get drawn out in certain circumstances. The term, as Paul discussed last week, is of course Qing, Ganqing to Qing. And think of Qing as an inherent dispositional response to something, right? And so the reason a plant will turn to the sun is because its Qing is to turn toward the sun. It doesn't think about doing that. It's its inherent dispositional response to the world. Dispositional meaning that in a certain circumstance, that is what it will always tend to do. And the view is we humans have an inherent qing. That qing involves the qi that will tend to be drawn out in certain situations. So a very significant example in the Gordian text, the Shinziming Chu, will put it, well, I have the qi of happiness, sadness, etc. within me. Certain circumstances will bring those out. So if something bad happens to me, someone I know passes away, I'm horribly sad. That that event, that moment drags out from me this chi of sadness. Someone screams at me and I'm angry, meaning that moment, that scream drags out from me a chi of anger. And so think of emotions not the way we often think of it, that we have emotions that are an inherent part of who we are, this true self that have a bad temper, so I will just get angry, meaning it's in me. The sense is rather no, Qing is about dispositional responses. And so it's not really emotion, it's it's the dispositional response includes what we would call emotion. In other words, my anger, but my anger is a part of the Qing of that moment, my inherent dispositional response. And I mention this because one of the key reasons that Qing will become so important in the early period is precisely out of the view that our inherent dispositional response to the world is usually not a terribly good response. So it's something you need to work on. It is also something you don't want to control, usually in a strong sense, because we want to be incredibly adept at sensing and working with situations. And you're only going to be able to do that if you have incredibly refined ways of responding to the world. So the sense is you're not trying to stop your Qing, you are trying to refine it. You're trying to become better at sensing the world and working with the world. Hence, all of the focus on things like training and ritual, which is all about not uncovering some pre-existent thing in there, some self that already exists. It's about refining our dispositional responses to the world. And then as you are refining these dispositional responses, you hopefully become better and more apt at sensing the world around you, working with the world around you, responding well to the world around you, even at the higher level, learning to work with those around you. So your very actions bring out better qualities in those around you. So it's all about relationships all the way down. Everything is relationships, everything is interaction. And then the self that you are creating out of this is the good self, as I will mention momentarily, is what you are trying to construct out of this work. And so the inherent self that you're born with would usually be seen as something um, limited and possibly very dangerous, right? It is the inherent dispositional response of humans, which is poor. It's usually not a very good response to the world. And hence, all of the focus is how do you construct or develop something better? Then, of course, you get intense debates as to what that process is, how active a construction process is, or is it rather a question of generation, emergence? Which are the faculties that you're using to do this? Where, if it's rituals that we're using, where did those rituals come from that would allow them to work with us? So Shunzi will very famously say, well, think of the rituals that exist in the world that work as the products of sages, but sages again are identical to all of us. They're no different from all of us. They simply did what Shunzi said they did, but any of us could have done it. And all they did was they sensed all that we were just discussing, and they began to work using their other functions. The fact that they had a mind, heart, the fact that they had eyes, ears, they become better at sensing the world and then sensing how we can train ourselves so we can channel and refine our dispositional responses. So Junzi will have this elaborate discussion of mourning rituals, Mouring, where it's all about if someone dies, our inherent dispositional response, of course, is devastated, horrible sadness. It tends to lead us to be horrible to those around us who are still alive. I mean, it brings out our worst qualities. And then for Shunzi, the question is always, how do you develop rituals that won't stop that? You're not trying to not be sad. It's you're trying to channel all of these emotions, all of these dispositional responses. And so the ritual is all about taking these responses and slowly over time working with seeing the deceased as first still with you, then not no longer with you. You're allowed to cry at a certain time. At a certain point, you must stop crying. And it's all about slowly working through the death such that over time, that deceased ceases to be this thing that is just destroying you, and over time can allow you to rework your life, rework your familial relationships, etc. I mention all of this because, again, the key here is for Shunza, the self that is going to come out of this is something you create. It is something that is constructed by rituals. Rituals themselves are constructs by the faculties of humans. Those faculties are designed to help channel our Qing. And if they do so effectively, it allows us to construct worlds where we can flourish. Note here, there is therefore nothing pre-given that is inherently good for Shunza. The only thing that is pre-given would be those tendencies that we have that are very dangerous if we don't work on them and train them. So I mention all of this to get to the larger point. If there's anything to this, it does mean when you get something that I think we could honestly call sincerity claims developing later in China, they tend to operate along a very different axis than the kinds of sincerity claims you see developing much later in Europe. If you even want to call some of the claims you find in classical China authenticity claims, I'm not sure we even want to use that term, but even if we did, it's going along a fundamentally different channel, precisely because you don't have this assumption of a true self always already there. In fact, I would say the assumption is we really have nothing like that. What we have are these tendencies, these responsive tendencies that are consistently seen as things we need to be working on, altering, and improving. So, much more to say, but let me stop right here first to see if there are any questions, concerns, thoughts that people would like to raise. Paul, please.
Um, well, this is so less on the what you were just saying. I basically agree with everything you were just saying about Chinese philosophy in particular. I was thinking though about the beginning when you were talking about how today, particularly in America, but maybe in other places as well. So we say that there's the self that maybe we find or is already within us, and then we have to put it into some sort of category. And I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, this is very different. For example, Rousseau, right, is a great paradigm
Exactly.
of individualism and what he says, and this idea of a true self that exists, right? And what
Yes,
he says, what was in the slide last week, right, in I think
precisely.
the third page of his autobiography is nature broke the mold with me, right? That
Yes,
no one else
yes,
in existence ever
yes,
was and perhaps ever will be like me, right?
yes,
And so, what is this difference that, so I don't want to derail things, but I'm thinking about this difference, right? Why does
yes,
this change from, I mean, you have these paradoxes in authenticity, right? You have three sort of core
yes,
paradoxes. One is that you're told to be authentic, right? So that's
yes,
already not authenticity. Another is that you have to be authentic in ways that are recognizable to others, right? That they
yes,
have to acknowledge this, otherwise it doesn't count. Um, so in some ways, right, I mean, the authenticity project from the start is something that can never really be done, at least theoretically, as it sort of should be. But so in my own understanding, and then with Hans Georg, we talk about profiles and how perhaps today we've shifted more to identifying with profiles. And there's a lot of overlap actually between profiles and this more role-based or sincerity-based
yes,
type of understanding. And one of
yes,
the similarities is that both, I mean, there's differences in these similarities as well, right? They're just sort of broad areas of overlap or places you can see similar sort of terminology and ideas. And one of them is that profiles are also categorized, right?
yes,
But the difference, of course, is that you have to constantly update them, right?
Right.
And that, yeah, even the categories themselves, right? Like maybe gender categories, right? That Anastasia mentioned last time. These, these also constantly change. So, but there is sort of, you like to be sort of within a group, right? Or
Yes.
within a particular type of profile. So, maybe, I mean, not today, but maybe in the future, this is something in this class, right? We can also talk about because I think that what happens a lot of times too is that, I mean, you can see this in literature from a couple hundred years ago that as there's a transition, right? This is also what many people say about technology, right? About like movies, right? Early movies are basically plays, right? And then they slowly become more like the movies that we know. Um, and so what you have, and whatever in Jane Austen, for example, is a lot of language of sincerity or language of roles, but then used in ways that are different, right? And basically what's
Yes.
happening is that authenticity or individualism is emerging. And I
Yes.
think some of what's going on, although I think it's very tricky and maybe it hasn't maybe we're not at the right moment to be able to identify this very well. But I think a lot of what happens today, too, is that the language of individualism and authenticity lingers, right, very strongly. But already this is becoming more profiles, right? I mean, the very early criticism of whatever your Instagram and your Facebook and whatever is that it's not authentic,
Right.
right? But then now this criticism has already become, to some extent, right, sort of not invalid, but nobody cares that much about it anymore, right? Because we now, I think, are recognizing more and more, if not explicitly, at least in some sense, that what goes on there is different and that it doesn't need to be authentic, although it still needs some sort of true investment, right? Or some sort of
Yes.
backing up. So I think, yeah, again, not to derail what you were
Right.
talking about, but maybe in the future, this is also something we can try to address, right? How what's happening now is also a bit, and this is also very relevant. I agree with you.
Yes.
I mean, if there's something like authenticity in China, you just look at the advertisements, the movies, blah, blah, blah. You don't really have something very similar. But in terms of profiles, you have an explosion of this, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
And everybody jokes, for example, I can't find people on my WeChat ever because they changed I'm like Chinese colleagues. Their photo is never them, okay? Never. And then the name is something, right? That I mean has some meaning, but it's just changing all the time. And what's also very interesting is often if you have meetings like this on Zoom, your Chinese, I mean, this is just a huge generalization, right? But often the Chinese colleagues have some background that's like an office or bubble, you know what I mean? That's not real, right? And then foreign colleagues, usually it's not the case, right? So I think when we talk about profiles too, that you can really see that in China that this has like exploded, right? And I think partly because moving from sincerity or role-based to profiles is an easier transition because a lot of the mechanisms are the same, right? You just have more dimacity in some sense in profiles, or they're more liquid. And the transition from authenticity to profiles is very difficult because authenticity demands sort of exactly the opposite in some ways of profiles, just as it went against sincerity or role-based understanding, right? So you have this slower transition, right? This constant lag, like you're pulling something along. So yeah, I don't know how much this contributes today, but maybe in the future, yeah, we can try to address some of this.
Oh, I think it contributes directly, and definitely let's not put it off. Let's absolutely discuss this. And Carlo, please jump in.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I think I agree with you that we're not really born with a certain kind of authentic self. But I have the impression that your exposition was mainly Confucian because of your
So far, yeah.
stressing of rituals and Xunzi. If we take the Daoist approach, some things seem a little bit different because Lao Tzu advocates returning to, it's not always clear to what, but you could say to something like an original nature, square quotes. And he also speaks a lot about the unhewn block, the pool, that is not yet contaminated. And I also think I think you're right in the way you discuss Qing. There's a relationship between the environment and the emotions, but it is to me not necessarily evident that the primary emotions should be dangerous or wrong. You could also make a case for the fact that in the more or less original state of nature, whatever that may be, the responses are in fact okay. You are hungry, you cry, you want food from your mother, etc., etc. Later, that derails in a lot of ways, but you could make a case that that emotions in a more or less natural state are okay because they are a kind of interface between what happens internally within you and what the environment can provide for you. And in that case, I think it's interesting. Perhaps you know the idea of Julian Jaynes about how consciousness came around. It's very controversial, but if you look, for instance, at the Greek situation in Homer, perhaps Dimitra knows more about that. You see that emotions are also externally originated. The gods make me angry.
Right. Yes.
And we of course think that that is all very stupid and that he were a bit of crazy. But you could say that was a better sketch of the factual situation that, to my view, is also valid today. That emotions are the interface between my inner and my outer, and not just something of myself.
Yes.
So that's what I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And let me say a few words, actually, largely in agreement, actually, and with the final points you're making, and then turn to your earlier points about Taoism. To begin with these latter points, I fully agree. I mean, one of the things that's intriguing is you really don't see in the early period attempts by people to say, let's get rid of Qing, let's control Qing. Now, as Paul mentioned, you in the Six Dynasties do get calls for people to be without Qing, but as he noted last week, they actually meant something quite different from this. And so the concern is precisely as you were saying, Carlo, that we actually want to preserve the Qing. The Qing is not something to destroy. It is absolutely, and I love your terminology here, it's the interface between us and the rest of the world. And the goal is to have that interface be as refined and subtle and nuanced as possible. So let me go back to some of these state of nature discussions. There are several. So they appear in Xunzi, they appear in many different versions in the Li Ji, and several appear in not terribly different ways in the Huainanzi. For all of the slight differences, though, one of the things that appears repeatedly is the view that in these state of nature views, in other words, when we humans lived in the world of Qing prior to any rituals or any of the other innovations of the sages, the view was we lived in perfect harmony with absolutely everything in the cosmos. However, we were like animals who also lived in perfect harmony, but the harmony of that world was a world in which we humans would die from starvation because we would eat things that came out of the ground, and oftentimes they'd be poisonous. So we would die. We would be eaten by tigers and wolves because they have fangs and claws, and we don't. In the winter, we would freeze to death because we don't have fur, whereas the animals do have fur. And so all animals have a certain niche that allows them to exist in this harmonious world. We actually were perfectly harmonious from that point of view. However, from the point of view of we later post these innovations looking backwards, we lived a horrible life because we were like animals. And what the sages did is look at, among the other things they did, but to use these examples, they would look at the things the animals had, like fur or claws, and they would make artificial versions of those. So in the case of fur, they would actually, kill animals and take the fur. But in the case of claws, they would take things in nature and just make them into pointed things like claws so they could become like weapons. And the narratives would go on, but the point being, getting to the larger issue here, the claim being we needed to transcend this world of harmony because in that world we're animals and we reorganized the world such that we humans could flourish, oftentimes quite literally at the expense of the harmony of the cosmos. And then there are discussions of what we therefore do to recreate a different harmony, but that different harmony would be one in which humans therefore become the center, not because we've lost our Qing, but because we've now learned to allow our Qing to play out fully. So now we still have, to use your example, the Qing of hunger, but now we can truly feed ourselves because we've domesticated grains, we've killed the wild animals, we've torn down forests. So we now have created a world where our desire for hunger is fully satiated, or at least much more so than in distant antiquity. Whereas in distant antiquity, simply in the world of Qing, we would feel hunger. It would be our interface to the world, and yet there was not enough food, or the food would be poisonous growing out of the ground before we domesticated it. So, getting back to your point with which I fully agree, you want the interface. The key is how do we both refine that interface as well as reconfigure our relationship to the world such that we can flourish, unlike the animals. And then I also want to touch back on the issue of Taoism. However, several other hands are up, so let me turn to those, and then I'll return to Taoism as they come in, and return to Paul's point as well. But Angela, let me turn things over to you.
Actually, my question is about the pre-given true self. I totally agree
Yes.
that in Western philosophy, maybe contemporary people think everybody has a pre-given true self, and they need to discover and find their true self. But I wonder, like maybe in early Confucianism, everyone also have a true self. But the property of this true self is not only about themselves, they are based on some relationships. So what they should do is not to realize their anticities. They should do something for others. For example, when a person is born, the person already has his father, so the person has the role as a son, has the role of as a citizen or so. So the true self, the pre-given true self, should play the responsibilities of these roles. And also, maybe this person will form a new relationship with others. But because this person have some pre-given moral abilities, this person should respond to other people in a certain way. Even though this person should be cultivated to a certain degree. Yeah, so the differences is now that in early Confucianism, human does not have a pre-given true self. The difference is that this true self is already associated with other people.
Um, Quite possibly, but let me give an example, say, from Mencius Munza, where someone who I think would say a lot of what you're saying, and yet he wouldn't use the true self notion. And I think he has a reason for doing so. And just to stick with your examples, for Mencius, I, as a child, would have certain inherent feelings toward my parents, the Qing, right? And so those are there. They're inherent in me, but it's not so much a true self for him. They are just inherent dispositional responses. I'm sure Shunza would say very much the same thing, albeit in a slightly different way. And the problem for Mencius is then how do I both refine those because I won't always act properly toward my parents. So how do I both refine that Qing, right? Refine that relationship. And then how do I extend that to other parts of the world, such that the feelings I'm developing within my immediate family can slowly get extended so I can also treat those who are not my family members in ethical ways. But the reason he's not going to put this in terms of a true self is that I think for him, the key is it really is all about cultivation. And the images that he'll use famously, of course, are these organic metaphors of think of plant, that its natural tendency is to grow, but it does need to be constantly worked on and cultivated. So the sense is, were we to truly cultivate that with which we have at birth, we are capable of becoming extraordinary sages. But it takes incredible work, incredible cultivation, to the point where, in Mencius's own reckoning, maybe you'll get a sage every 500 years. So it's an incredibly rare thing. And so if it's a true self, I think for Mencius, it takes out that incredible need for cultivation. And Shunzi, if anything, is going to make it even more dramatic. So for Shunzi, the sense is really very few of us will ever become a sage, even though we're all capable of doing it. So for Shunzi, it's much more a concern of, given that so few of us will ever become sages, we want to get as many people as possible trained and in positions of power, because hopefully together they can sort of create a slightly better world than the world we currently have. But again, getting back to the heart of the question, I think both would be hesitant about a true self notion, just because the danger is it pushes against what they, I think, in some ways care most about, which is the incredible need for constant training and cultivation. Anyway, just a thought. Great. And Jonah, please jump in.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting stuff. So I'm wondering about how the ancient Chinese picture of like a qi-based or a qing-based person compares to our contemporary notions. Since it seems like those ancient notions are broadly, at the risk of being kind of prejudiced, but broadly materialistic, naturalistic kind of view, where there are these like natural elements moving around, and that explains human behavior, and these elements also exist out in other things. And similarly, today, like in the 20th century, we've been moving more and more towards naturalistic conceptions of the human being and human behavior, where now the kind of the popular folk idea. There's lots of popular reference to my serotonin levels, etc. Right? And or maybe, oh, that's like my ADHD made me do that or something, right?
Exactly.
Popular ideas of there are things happening within us or elements within us that then explain how things, how we act, how we respond to things. So these two conceptions of the person and then the styles of explanation might not be too far off, is what I'm thinking. And what I'm thinking maybe is the most pertinent difference here is that in the ancient conception, there's lots more like uniformity among people in the broad makeup of and distribution maybe of those internal elements. So in Mencius, everybody has the four sprouts and then responds in similar ways to similar stimuli. In Shinzutsu, all creatures of the same kind, of the same dispositions, cognize things in the same way. And, so there's kinds of a more like high level synoptic view of human beings and how they act in societies, and less interest in this individual personality and variation among individuals. Whereas today we're kind of obsessed with the idea of there being individual variation among people. And conversely, the notion of a common nature is much less popular, almost taboo in some circles in like a broadly American culture.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. And building upon what you said, it's intriguing paradoxically how these two positions work out. So yeah, let me begin with just your examples from classical China. Part of what's so intriguing there is that yes, there definitely is a view that we have these energies that, as you said, in some ways sound very much like the very naturalistic way of talking, very much in contemporary America. Um, but note the differences too, which are very telling in exactly the places you were mentioning. So in classical China, but I'll focus mainly on the early Chinese material for the following few sentences, the view tends to be that don't think of these as substances, think of these as endless relationships. And the reason that's important is just, for example, to think of the natural world before we even get to humans, the sense would be these ways that the energies interact, the ways that the chi interacts, tends to form patterns. But the tending to form patterns is something very different from, for example, natural laws that govern deterministically the ways that phenomena interact. The sense is rather, think of these as patterns. So, seasonal change, for example, we can categorize the energies of the world in terms of yin and yang. Those yin and yang energies are endlessly interacting. Because they endlessly interact, it means you get a general pattern of seasonal change, where you get the cold drawing out the heat. When it gets too hot, it draws out the cold, and hence a general pattern. But it's a general pattern meaning that the world often doesn't quite operate that way. You'll get weird spells when it's too hot, when it should be cold, too cold when it should be hot. It's not an absolute law, it's a general pattern. And the sense is we humans fall into these same patterns. So in terms of, because of our chi gets in these patterns of interaction with those around us. They're general patterns. There are endless exceptions to them, but they're general patterns. But of course, with humans, getting back to the point we we're discussing with Carlo, these patterns are often seen as dangerous or in some manner, shape, or form limiting. And so your goal is to refine, improve, develop your interactions to allow something more than the patterns we tend to normally fall into, the sort of Qing patterns that we tend to have just in our basic dispositional response to the world. So the reason I say that is the intriguing push of that as the starting claim is toward this endless cultivation, this endless refinement, the sense is you're constantly trying to move beyond this inherent tendency we have to react to the world in a certain way, these inherent patterns we tend to fall into with other human beings. Whereas I agree with you. So it's so intriguing when you look at the modern American discussions. You're absolutely right. It's people will say, "Oh, yes, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, if it's high or low. Well, I'm having a low serotonin day, or maybe it's high, actually." I don't quite understand the serotonin, but I take your point completely. But it's intriguing that when it's discussed, it really tends to be kind of within a Newtonian worldview, right? There are natural laws that govern phenomena deterministically. And so if I have X amount of serotonin, I will be overly angry or overly happy. Again, I'm not quite sure how serotonin is claimed to work, but the idea is like there's some deterministic thing. I have too much serotonin, so therefore I need to cut down my serotonin or vice versa, which is a very different sense than tendencies of patterns that you're endlessly trying to refine. The sense is there's a limited number of phenomena in the world. We can understand them, we can control and regulate them. And again, who I am as a person comes down in part to do I, in my true self, have higher serotonin or higher adrenaline or whatever so the reason I'm mentioning this is often we think in America, well, we are the ones who are all in favor of creativity, liberation, etc. And yet, as we were discussing last week, it often works out paradoxically to be the exact opposite. We're very committed to the view that there are certain slots all of us can be fitted into, that there are certain ways of defining our behavior that could be understood. Very particular drugs could be taken to properly regulate our emotions at any given time according to what makes us our best self, a term that we often use. Whereas in China, you would really never see that in the early period because it's all about refining this Qing, which means by definition, it's all about training yourself to be something different than you already are.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. But I think there's some other hands.
Yes, in fact, I think Paul, your hand was up for a while. You've taken it down, but please
Yeah,
jump in.
because I think Luya wants to say something.
Oh,
So
yes, absolutely.
I'm going to give
Oh,
my
yes,
time
yes,
to Luya.
please. There's time for both. Please.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Brother Puett. My question is about
Michael.
Ah, thank you, Mike. My question is about your talks on Qing. You mentioned that there is a original harmony in the nature world that before human do something else, and then our human joins the world and like to make it better to suit for us. And in this process, we use our qing, especially in Chinese philosophy. My question is that. Um, you also mentioned about the emotion in the Western philosophy. How could that the Chinese and Western, Chinese qing and Western emotion make the harmony of the human world different? I mean, how what's the difference between their two kinds of harmonious world with their different emotion and qing? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So let me give a very concrete example. So this is from the Huainanzi, chapter 13, which will give this entire narrative that's literally along these lines. And so the opening portion of the chapter is in distant antiquity, humans lived in flawless harmony with the entire world, and it goes on about how everything just inherently worked together in these beautiful, harmonious patterns, just like the movement of the seasons, and that's what humans were like in the interaction with all the other animals, etc. So wonderfully harmonious um, patterns based upon these inherent dispositional responses. Then it says, okay, but now let's go back and look at it again. And it then redescribes that initial harmony in terms of the ways I was just mentioning. So that's all true, but in these patterns of harmony, we would eat poisons and die young, animals would eat us, we would freeze to death in the winter. So the idea was, sure, it's a harmonious world, but we were just like animals and worse off than other animals because at least a wolf could live a little bit longer because it could eat other people, whereas I mean it could eat us actually. Whereas we were actually really bad at that, and we didn't have fur, so we were much less good than say grizzly bears that could live through the winter. So we were like animals, but not terribly well-adjusted animals. So we lived harmoniously, but in that harmonious world, we all died very young. And that didn't necessarily bother us because that was the way the world operated, right? That was the natural world. And then it was human sages who noticed the things I was mentioning before, that actually, well, we don't have to be eaten by tigers because we can artificially create the same sorts of things that tigers have. And we can, once we've done that, we can start eating animals too. And then once we're starting to eat animals, we also realize we can also change other parts of the world. We can, for example, domesticate grains, noticing oftentimes things grow out of the ground that kills us, but some of them don't kill us, and we can just selectively breed the things that don't kill us, and we grow more of those, meaning we, over time, create domesticated grains. And we notice in general, yes, we get cold at a certain time, but this is part of these general patterns where it rains, it doesn't rain, it gets cold, it gets hot. And if we organize these domesticated grains with our planting, we actually organize those around an entire seasonal change in which those patterns become helpful for us for generating these domesticated grains. And the argument goes on about the creation of shelter and clothing, blah blah blah. But then getting to the larger point, then the full argument of the chapter is now that we've done all this, we are once again creating a harmony. But in this harmony, humans are now the center. We have now reorganized our relationship with everything such that it is now harmonious, but in this harmonious world, we humans flourish. We live long lives. We don't starve to death anymore. We don't freeze to death in the winters anymore. The animals don't kill us. We kill them. And so we've recreated this harmony in which we can flourish. And so the sense is, had we simply stuck with our Qing, we would still be freezing in the winter. We would still be eaten by tigers. It's precisely by realizing that these patterns are changeable and alterable, and you don't create a world without patterns, without interaction, without relationships, but you can make them very different. And in this case, at least according to Huainanzi, better because not that they're better for the animals, obviously, they're horrible for the animals, but they're better for us. And so, according to the Huainanzi, we have created a world where we can flourish, still based upon endless interrelationships and patterns, but they're simply radically different new patterns because we have altered our relationships to everything else accordingly.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Can I follow up a
Please, yeah,
bit?
please, of course, absolutely.
Yeah. Uh, as for the Western world, they also like use something. Maybe not emotion. They create a new. Also a new harmonious world like that. Also human centered. So what's the difference
Yes.
between that word with Asian Chinese word?
Oh, yes. So let me just give a close parallel, which are
Mm.
state of nature arguments, say, in 17th century Europe, which at first glance seem incredibly similar. And yet the differences are also, for that reason, all the more telling. So in the 17th century, you'll get these arguments. Let's imagine a world of distant antiquity and imagine what that world was like, and then from that make arguments as to how we got to this world, both the dangers, but also normatively the way it should be organized. But note the differences. The whole move of the state of nature arguments there isn't to work out this world of endless patterns and relationships that we're improving upon. The view is let's forget all of history, culture, everything. Wipe out the messiness of the world, in other words, find sovereign individuals fighting over limited resources. So these sovereign individuals are constantly in war with each other to eat these or to get these limited resources. Then the sovereign individuals decide it is in their best personal interest to give up some of their sovereignty to create some kind of overarching governmental structure that can, yes, limit their sovereign freedom, but by so limiting it, it gives them the power to therefore thrive under that limited sovereignty. So the claim would be, okay, we accept a Leviathan because the Leviathan will maintain peace and order, or in a slightly different version, we will accept a state that will create a regulated marketplace because in that marketplace we can buy and sell and therefore thrive. So we lose a little bit of our sovereignty as individuals, but by giving up a little bit of that sovereignty and accepting a sovereignty over us, we're able to more fully live out our lives. Now, the implication of this, of course, is clear, but I'll just lay it out. The whole point of these exercises is to say what really matters is the sovereign individual, and then we are learning to accept what limits on that sovereignty we should be willing to cede in order to accept a world of peace and prosperity. Um, Underneath it all, in other words, is the sovereign individual. It's really not about patterns of interaction. It's really not about refining our dispositional responses to the world. It's really about saying what really matters is sovereign individuality, and then we sovereign individuals choosing when to give up a little bit of that sovereignty so we can succeed. So they seem so similar, and yet the ultimate push of the narratives is actually going in very, very different philosophical directions. And of course, if you do a genealogy, the state of nature arguments in the 17th century will very much work into the notions of sovereign individuals that we now so take for granted in the West. And you really don't see anything like that in these early Chinese distant antiquity arguments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great set of questions. And Paul, please.
Oh yeah, I was just going to I was just gonna mention basically you already said very similar things, but the earlier question about I sort of actually forget the question now. This was like 2 questions ago, maybe. Yeah, let me just skip it. I don't remember. I have my
Sure,
notes, but I don't have the question, so
absolutely.
it was Jonah's question. If you want to repeat Jonah, or we can. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I can do a summary. So basically, what I was suggesting is that, like, the ancient Chinese picture where people are these kinds of, confluence of different, energies or what have you, different kinds of stuff, and the contemporary, uh, like folk psychological or kind of pop scientific ideas of how we're kind of, our behavior is explained by serotonin levels or different mechanisms in our brains, right? That those might actually be more actually be quite similar in that they're kind of broadly materialistic, naturalistic explanations of behavior. And so I was suggesting that maybe the key difference is that, we have more this idea that each individual will have a different constitution, and some different combination of inner stuff. Whereas, in ancient China, there was more the assumption that everybody has basically the same allotment, the same inner dispositions.
Yeah.
So that was my suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think, I mean, there is some room for but I mean, it also can depend very much on the thinker, right? Because, for example, if you look at Guoxiang, very interestingly, he takes the term "sing," right, which would be the term, Confucius, for example, very famously says, different practices make people different, but "sing," it's 差不多, right? It's basically
Yeah,
the
yeah.
same. And yeah, a lot of thinkers, you use "sing" basically to classify general similarities between things. But then for Guoxiang, actually "sing" becomes that which actually makes each thing distinct from other
Right,
things, right? So everything has its own "sing." He connects this
right.
with Fen, right? Both that can be like more social, right? And then more biological or metaphysical, maybe something like this. And other notions. So that would also be something maybe we can explore in a further class. But I also think, I mean, Michael, you basically explained it, so I'm just using different terminology, right? But I think one of the differences too is that today we take a much more mechanistic sort of view towards these things, right? So, I mean, what you're explaining, Jonah, is that, I mean, most of like philosophical and religious thought, basically, we don't like things that we're uncertain about, right? So we search for certainty. But then we do that project in different ways, right? And I think so, Michael, you were talking a lot about patterns. I think maybe another way to think of this is like this is a more sort of aesthetic approach, right? And just like you were
Yeah,
saying, Jared, it's like looking more for things that can be similar, right? But and much more concentrated on interaction, as Angel mentioned before. But I think another sort of key difference, and this relates to this uncertainty, is that there's a much higher level of being okay with that we don't control that much, we don't know that much, we can't predict that much, right? And so you take a more sort of aesthetic approach to these things, right? And you concentrate much more on interaction. Well, you sort of have to concentrate on interaction because people aren't really alone that much anyways, right? So now like all sorts of materialistic sort of considerations go in. But yeah, I think that helps us like sort of sharpen the actual issue, right? Which is that in many ways actually what's going like this view that yeah, basically this view of searching for certainty is very much similar. But then yeah, there's different orientations or different sort of structures that we can use to do this. Maybe we
yeah. I
should.
think. Oh, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say we should wrap up soon because we have to talk with Zhu Ling about next week.
Oh, okay. Well, so yeah. So, is there time for me to say a quick
Yeah, of
word in
course. No,
response
no,
to
of course, of course.
Carlos' question about Taoism? But we can it can also hold off for later session.
Why don't you start with it and then we'll do more Taoism next time. So
Sure,
start.
absolutely. So going back to Carlo's initial point about Taoism and the notion of a true self there. So let me throw out a possible way of thinking about that material. It is a material where later Zhenwu, literally true self, does appear. So let me throw out a possible way of reading this. My reading, first to begin with the earlier text, like the Lao Tzu, I actually wouldn't read a notion of a true self there. At least my reading is the sense is that think of everything in the cosmos, everything that we mistakenly, according to text, think of as differentiated things, all emerge from the Tao. And so the sense is you're training yourself to see everything as emergence. And the sage is one who is just ever better at number one, seeing that emergence, sensing how everything is emerging out of the Tao. And eventually, a true sage becomes like the Tao. In other words, helping to generate worlds through his very mode of being. Um, and the reason I put it that way is that if you read it that way, all of the talk about going back, looking back, it's I read it, you're looking back to that emergent process. You're looking back to the Tao. You're not looking back to an original individual self. You're looking back to the Tao. The closer you can get to it, the closer you both are to understanding and working with these emergent properties. And going very quickly, when you later see notions of the Zhenwu, you can literally translate it true self, I read it as coming out of that. So thinking of texts like the Lao Tzu Zhongjing that will actually use that term, so this is a third century AD text. So they will use it, but it's, as I read the text, with it working very much in the same cosmology, and you're generating the Zhenwu, right? like it's precisely by the work of cultivation that you literally gestate the Zhenwu within you, and that Zhenwu is, of course, the Tao. And so you are gestating the Tao within you. So it's, in a sense, taking the notion that you see in the Tao Te Ching and working it out in terms of cultivation such that you literally feel the formation of the Tao within you. And that's what the Zhenwu is. It's you are gestating this, you could even call it a new self, but the new self is the Tao. So it's not, as I read it, a pre-given true self that you're born with, that you're looking in, trying to discover. It's you're learning to sense the Tao, and in later texts, you are literally gestating the Tao in you, such that you literally become the Tao. You in a very literal sense become Lao Tzu. Anyway, so just throwing out that a possible reading. We can discuss those texts in much more detail later.
Yeah, great. So why don't we